Welcome everybody to tonight's briefing. We are very honored and happy to have with us Dr. Ian Lesser. Ian is Vice President at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and a member of the GMF's executive team managing programs across the organization. He also serves as an executive director of the Brussels office here of the German Marshall Fund. And in that capacity, we have been able to meet each other and work together on several occasions. And he leads the GMF's work here in Brussels on the foreign affairs and security policy, the Mediterranean, Turkey, and also the wider Atlantic. Prior to joining the GMF, Dr. Lesser was a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and vice president and director of studies at the Pacific Council on International Policy. And he also holds a chair in the transatlantic trade and economy at the College of Europe in Bruges, which is, I would say, the primary education for many of Europe's diplomats who end up serving for the EU institutions. So obviously, as all of you know, we will discuss today the recent election of the next president of the United States, President Trump, and how that will impact the EU-US relations, and also how it will affect the EU-Israel relations with this new administration that will start shortly in Washington. So maybe we can start with a general question. European policymakers have spent months preparing for Donald Trump's potential return to the White House, but I think if we're honest, many of them don't really know how all of this will unfold. As the GMF's head of the Brussels office, you are and have been in the center of EU-US relations. I think the GMF is maybe the primary organization who is working on this topic all the time, with offices across Europe and in the United States. And many believe that the America First concept will again sum up Trump's approach to trade and other policies, and amplified warnings of possible American isolationism. So what, in your opinion, was the general appreciation in Brussels of the election of Donald Trump for a second time? And how are Trump nominees perceived here in Brussels and in the Brussels institutes? And to add one other element, how do politicians and policymakers believe it will impact the transatlantic relationship? If we can start with that easy question.
Well, first of all, Matti, thank you very, very much for the invitation. It's very good to be with you again and for this to speak to your group. Yeah, I mean, we've been watching these issues in Brussels for a long time. I've been here in Brussels for 13 years, so through a number of American administrations of both parties. There was an experience with President Trump before here, which has left a legacy. But the truth is, you know, that experience from 2016 really doesn't necessarily tell you a lot. You know, Europe was at pains to try to figure out, to decode Donald Trump and how to work with him. Well, the last time around, it worked and it didn't work. I mean, the lessons from that were largely mixed, and I don't think anybody took away a very firm feeling. And in the meantime, of course, his coming into office again has a very different backdrop. The situation is simply different. The economic conditions around the world are different. There is a war in Europe, which is different. There is a growing competition with China that was already there, but it's taken on new contours, obviously, since 2016, 2020. So the world has changed around this issue. There is no question that this is intensely watched in Brussels. And it is true, one has to be a little bit careful when one says Europe, of course. I mean, you will all on this call understand this, but it's very easy to say Europe. And, you know, if you mean by that the European institutions in Brussels, it's one question. But if you mean Europe as a whole, it's slightly different, because obviously there will be individual capitals around Europe that will be more or less comfortable with Donald Trump's election. There are different political tendencies, different parties in Europe that would be perfectly comfortable with this. So one thing for Europe is about figuring out what this administration is about, what it will do, how to work with it or not. The other, of course, is this larger question, which you didn't ask, but let me put it on the table, of what it will mean for politics in Europe, because it could have a kind of exemplary effect on elections that are forthcoming in Europe. We can talk about that, maybe defer that one a little bit. I think part of the issue here is that some of the big questions raised by Donald Trump's reelection have to do with much bigger issues that were already on the table here in Europe. And they're not easy to solve. But this election outcome has really given everything a shove. So there was an existing anxiety about European competitiveness in general, economic competitiveness, but in many different sorts of fields. Some of it, a lot of it's structural. There's an existing anxiety about European security because there's a war in Europe. And even if you don't have a more isolationist or unilateralist America, the fact that the US will be gradually focusing on other areas puts a lot of pressure on Europe. And the fact that Donald Trump and his appointees talk explicitly about this puts even more pressure on it. Can Europe defend itself without America? Well, the answer today is no, you can't. How long would it take for Europe to build the capability to do that? Well, presumably many years. So these questions are not just about how to work with, an individual who is very different in terms of political engagement, but also these bigger picture questions that his election raises.
Yeah, so during the election campaign before the summer, which resulted in the re-election of Ursula von der Leyen, who was already the president of the European Commission, she mentioned as the top 3 priorities for her next term, the war in Ukraine, European defense and security, as you mentioned, European defense industry being part of that, and EU competition on a global market and the EU's economic resilience. So starting with the war in Ukraine, Donald Trump has said he will end the war within 24 hours. Many European politicians and policymakers have shared concerns about the US possible disengagement. We don't know. And the new US administration even willing to consider to make, as some say, a favorable peace deal with Putin, including giving up part of Ukrainian territories. Europe may no longer, or at least much less, rely on the US for its defense and security, as you also mentioned. And Donald Trump threatened during his first term to leave NATO and has repeatedly said on the campaign trail that Washington wouldn't come to the rescue of allies who invest enough in their military in case of a Russian aggression. So going a little bit deeper into this, how do you see this with regard to the European defense, which is a big topic on the agenda of the new European Commission, but also with regard to NATO? What do you expect to see in the coming months?
Well, look, I think, the fear of American isolationism, I think, is misplaced. I don't think that's the right way to read this, but it relates to your questions. I think yes, unilateralism, perhaps a different kind of priority given to different regions around the world, perhaps, a much more demanding posture when it comes to what allies are paying or not paying, for sure. But that's different than isolationism. That's different than the idea of an America that simply retreats into inactivity in the world. I don't think that's what you're going to see. And I think that's not the right way to read it. I think in the EU dynamics with the US and the NATO piece are rather different in this respect. I think for the European Union, this is a big concern, not least because the Biden administration was very unusual. It was very unusual in its willingness to see the European Union as an interlocutor on a whole set of issues where they don't necessarily have to. Yes, on trade you have to, but on many other issues you don't, on sanctions, on export controls, on many things. Biden had a very good relationship with President von der Leyen, who's now been reelected, reappointed, shall I say. That was a very close relationship. Their staffs had a close working relationship. This wasn't always true in previous administrations. Even, for example, in the Obama administration, wasn't quite as EU-centric. when it came to relations with Europe. So, we're coming out of a period that was particularly positive in a way between Brussels and Washington, even though there were differences clearly about the IRA and about many other things. Basically, at a certain level, there was a closeness there. And that's likely to change because one thing I think we can say about incoming President Trump is that he is not keen on the EU. I think, if I'm reading this from afar, I think his approach to the world is very much driven by individual countries, but even more than that, individual leaders, for better or for worse. And so, but institutions don't rate in the same way, and the EU itself, along with the UN, is obviously not hugely popular with him or his appointees. So there's a lot of anxiety around that in the European Union. NATO is a slightly different question. I think, look, I don't personally think the United States is leaving NATO. There's too much at stake for the United States in staying. I'm fully among those who thinks it's absolutely in America's interest to have allies in Europe helping us with our own interests. We're not here out of philanthropy. We're here because it's in our interest to do it. But I'm well aware that incoming President Trump and many of his appointees take a much harder view of this, much more transactional, much more willing to press Europe about burden sharing, which isn't new, of course. Every American administration in recent years has come to Europe with this message that we would like Europe to pay more and do more. It's just that Donald Trump came and brought it with a different style, if you like. So when you look at what's likely to happen now in NATO, I think it could get pretty adventurous inside the alliance with the US, but also others who are not always so easy against the back. But it's really meaningful. It's not just kind of politics and free-flowing debate. Now we have a war in Europe. Now, but I think the US will stay in. I think in terms of Ukraine and a ceasefire, I mean, I take incoming President Trump at his word. I mean, that he wants to see an end to this for a number of reasons. I think he likes to be decisive and to make things happen. Good luck to him if he can do this between Ukraine and Russia. I am a little skeptical that Russia has a lot of incentives to negotiate, at least under conditions that we would find acceptable, certainly that Ukraine would find acceptable, but let's test it, let's see. But he's not out of step in that respect, President-elect Trump, with a growing mood of frustration with the war and a desire to see something different. And I suspect that's true in Ukraine as well. So he surely will try, whether he can be successful or not. The U.S. will remain engaged in European security, but will we be paying the same bills that we've been paying for Ukraine's support? I very much doubt there'll be scope for that. It was already getting problematic. So, this all falls back on Europe, obviously, to do more.
So that's also, I mean, just going back to something you said earlier, division or unity in Europe. I mean, we've seen Trump being quite close to some of the leaders in Europe that have not always been very much pushing for unity and actually have often blocked decision making in the European Council, the platform of the 27 member states, where many decisions have to be taken in unanimity. So do you think this change of administration will actually enhance a more united, decisive Europe, or will it also possibly divide Europe more than it sometimes even is?
It's a very good question, and it's asked here very directly. I don't know the answer to that. I think this could go either way in a sense. There's every reason, and there is in Brussels this mantra about the European Union advancing when it faces crises, and to some extent that's been true if you look at COVID or you look at some other things, but don't always bet on it. And when it comes to something like this, it's just as plausible that some countries within the European Union will choose to kind of go it alone, that feel that they could get more out of a bilateral relationship with the United States than in a way subordinating their interests to others within the European Union. there's also a question of how you pay for defense. And who feels the risk. There are very big differences. If you're sitting in Poland or in the Baltic states or on the Black Sea, you feel a very different sense of the risk than if you're in other places, or at least the risks look different. I mean, if you're in Italy or Spain or Greece, you face lots of risks, but they're not the same. They're different.
And if we're looking, sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, I just thought because another element that has been discussed a lot is the trade policy, and Trump has Elia even weg. Yes, this is parenting 2024.
This is the next generation of transatlantic leaders.
Yes. So Trump has promised to impose tariffs on every single European good entering the US. And he announced across-the-board tariffs of 10 to 20% and up to 60% on goods coming from China. And in order to bring back jobs to the US, to basically do that, the EU has failed to fix lingering trade disputes on steel and aluminium tariffs, green subsidies on electric cars, and reviving the highest court of the World Trade Organization, mainly under the Biden administration. Those were things that Europe maybe could have pushed harder for. And the EU has also preemptively locked and loaded some retaliatory measures. But how do you see this unfold with these promises that were made by Trump? And with regard to China, do you see that Trump might draw Europe into a trade war with China?
Well, the fears here certainly is yes. Look, I mean, it won't surprise you that the general view, certainly in the Brussels orbit, is that a descent into trade wars and growing tariffs and all sorts of protectionist policies of other kinds don't bode well for the international economy. They also don't bode well for stability. And here I share some of this. I'm not an economist, but I share some of this. I think that it's a very bad fit in a very dangerous world. It's a very bad fit to try to make economic nationalism, a trade wars fit with alliance cohesion. If you need more alliance cohesion and capability and agreement on foreign and security policy, well, how do you do that when you're engaged in a trade war with your allies? I think it just doesn't work. Something has to give. Quite apart from the more specific competitiveness concerns in Europe, which, as I said before, are pre-existing because of higher energy prices here, because of many other things, a different entrepreneurial culture here, all sorts of reasons why Europe was already concerned about its competitiveness. And under these conditions, that is only likely to get worse. In addition to that, I do think at a minimum, the United States is going to be pressing European allies much harder than they've already been doing, which they've been doing, on policy towards China. It is, if perhaps this is all driven mostly, certainly I think for President-elect Trump, mostly by policy towards China. But in that sense, there's kind of people on the line here who are mostly, I suppose, sitting in the United States will have a better sense. But my perception is there are very few things that Democrats and Republicans agree on these days. A harder line on China, it may be one of them, for different reasons. Some focus on economics, some on human rights, some on military political competition, other things. In any case, that harder attitude has been growing in Europe too, but not as fast. And I think Europe really fears that it's going to be pressed to do more vis-a-vis China. And also, in any case, even if these tariffs are aimed mainly at China rather than Europe, Europe is going to face the blowback from that. Because China, the natural response will be for Chinese firms to dump goods in Europe. With all the consequences that are already a source of anxiety here. So this is part of the equation. Is it bluff and bluster, or is it real? I suspect we're going to find out.
So following some of these developments, especially with a very strong focus of the United States in the past years on China, on Asia, the US has also sought to reduce its involvement in the Middle East. But with the current threat of a regional war following what we have seen in Israel. Opportunities also arising from the Abraham Accords that were, of course, one of the successes of the previous Trump administration. The role of Iran and its proxies destabilizing the Middle East and their influence. How do we expect the new US administration to act in this new context? And will it push Washington to be maybe even more engaged in the region and strengthen alliances to realign the region with US priorities, meaning maybe a more activist US policy in the region rather than what have many people mentioned, an isolationist approach? And how do you see the EU following the US or playing a role in this context?
Yeah, first of all, I think there's something of a mythology about American disengagement from the region anyway. I know it's a source of anxiety in the Gulf, sometimes in Israel and other places. I actually, frankly, in recent years, don't see too much evidence of that. It's true, other things have loomed large, but there's no question that look, the older Trump administration's principal foreign policy success was indeed the Abraham Accords, in my view, anyway. And I think a lot of people, even in the Biden administration, were willing to admit that and preserve it and seek even to extend it. So I do think there is a kind of natural inclination in this incoming administration to take the Middle East seriously. Part of that is about power projection and presence of US forces in the region, and that can have its ups and downs. But in terms of political engagement, support for Israel, a tough line on Iran, I think those are all going to be part of the equation for sure. If you look at what incoming President Trump has said about policy towards Israel, if you look at people he's appointing, these are all strongly pro-Israeli voices. Real hawks, many of them on Iran, none of them isolationists in the classic sense.
Yeah.
So, I don't think you're going to find a lot of kind of dovish voices, if I can say, when it comes to some of these key conflicts we're facing in the Middle East at the moment.
Yeah. No, so thanks for mentioning that, because that was also going to be my next question. How do you think this new administration that seems quite pro-Israeli in their approach will engage? And I mean, do you foresee a different approach from this new administration with regard to the ongoing war in Gaza against Hamas? And of course, we're now looking at a possible peace agreement in Lebanon with Hezbollah, but this is also part of a larger picture. So let me start with that, and then I'll ask about the EU.
Well, look, I think if I were to somehow decode the Trump view of all of this, and I think this is probably shared by a lot of the people he's bringing in, there are sort of two things going on here. They don't always work well together, but I think they're both operating. One is, a very strong ideological attachment to Israel for different reasons, for different people, whether it's strategic or it's ethical or it's culture. There are all kinds of reasons to be just American interest, history, whatever you want to say. At the same time, I think President-elect Trump himself is actually very cautious about the use of force. I think he tends to be, if I can read behavior from the last experience, very cautious about the projection of American military power. He's not an interventionist in that sense. Now, Iran at some level could be an exception to this, I suppose, but I don't think it's at the forefront of his thinking. I think he would rather, maybe even under very different conditions, come back to some kind of a nuclear agreement and say, well, look, I got a better deal. And he pulled the United States out of the JCPOA when he was in power.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean to say that he wouldn't want to see an agreement. He just would like to see it on different terms. So I would imagine this is going to be a rather activist administration, maybe, when it comes, in some ways, to the Middle East. Will the administration be comfortable with everything that Israel does, at least this government does in Israel? Probably not. A lot of this is about personal chemistry or not. My sense is that it was a mixed experience the last time. But at the level of strategic interest, at the level of general commitment, I would see every reason to have a very strong American commitment to Israel in the next years. And on your question on Europe, no, I think in many cases Europe will not be on the same page about this for all the reasons that we know. I mean, and some of it has to do with differences of view about Israel, differences of view about the situation in Gaza as it's evolved, or in Lebanon, but also different attitudes towards the use of force, different histories, all sorts of things. But also simply because it's very hard for Europe, at its, to build a consensus to do anything in Europe in the foreign policy area is very tough. And this is one of the tougher things to build consensus around.
But do you think there might be a renewed attempt from the Trump administration to come to some sort of agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians that might involve the European Union? I mean, they were very skeptical of this the plan that was presented during his past administration.
I mean, in general, the group coming in is not going to be as supportive, and perhaps will be explicitly less supportive of a two-state solution, which has been a sort of mainstay of American policy for many years. But you need to be able to make it happen, and the conditions now just are not particularly good for this. If there were a dramatic change of view in Israel or on the Palestinian side, if something else happens in this space, well, I think this administration coming in would be supportive of it. Why not? The parties are willing to do it, why not? But will they push this? I doubt it. I think they would likely put more effort into where they were in the last time around, which was in broadening the peace. But of course, that itself has become more difficult, because it's become very difficult for additional countries like Saudi Arabia to come into something like the Abraham Accords, because their public just can't quite get there given what's happening. And so these things are not really separable in the way that they were when Trump was last in office.
Thank you, Ina, for this very in-depth overview of the current developments.